You're listening to Honestly Aging by Friends Life Care Vigor, a podcast where we explore what it's like getting older, the peaks, the valleys, and everything in between. In this season of Honestly Aging by Friends Life Care Vigor, we're covering topics related to solo aging. I'm your host, Cheryl Praska. Let's grow old together. On today's episode, I'm joined by my colleagues, Houle and Beth Morley, care coordinators with Friends Life Care. Ellen is a licensed occupational therapist with more than 7 years working with older adults. She has worked in a variety of settings, including home care, hospice, short-term rehabilitation facilities, and retirement communities. She earned her master's degree in occupational therapy from Temple University and executive certification in home modifications from the University of Southern California. Ellen values the importance of a well-rounded and proactive approach to healthcare. In her free time, Ellen is an avid cyclist and drummer, playing in multiple bands in the greater Philadelphia area. Beth holds a Master of Social Work degree and a bachelor's degree in international studies and has 25 years of experience in public and private positions with a background in case management systems, long-term care coordination, and program development. Previously, Beth worked for 9 years with refugees and immigrants in emergency services, program management, and community-based social services. She also was employed as a clinical social worker in a skilled nursing facility and spent 2 years coordinating community-based services for older adults in Virginia. Ellen and Beth, welcome and thank you for being here. How are you today?
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl.
Absolutely. So you are joining me today to discuss loneliness. We'll cover the causes, effects, and ways to combat it. In addition, we'll talk about insights you gleaned from Friends Life Care members about loneliness and how your organization deals with the issue. Beth, can we start with you and perhaps you could answer, what does the research tell us about loneliness?
So the research shows that loneliness is a global issue, particularly for older adults and particularly for older adults with particular challenges. Globally, research shows that some countries report 1 in 3 older adults report being lonely. In the United States, over 18 million older adults report or live alone and are at potential risk of being lonely. Loneliness and isolation have a negative impact on older adults, both their physical and mental health, the quality of life, and it increases the risk of mortality. It's as bad as for one's health as smoking, obesity, and the lack of physical activity. For example, it increases the risk of stroke by 32%. It can increase the risk of heart disease by 29%. Research shows that people who have experienced loneliness have higher rates of depression. Additionally, increased risk of susceptibility to scams. There are also people who are lonely have increased risk of changes in sleep patterns. So it really affects the quality of life across the spectrum for older adults. And the issue with loneliness and health is that, number one, loneliness can directly impact one's health negatively, but additionally, people who have poor health status are also at greater risk of loneliness, just because they may be less able to get out, less able to engage. And people who are lonely are more apt to participate in behaviors which are negative, or it can negatively impact their health. So it has this sort of continuous negative feedback loop. But additionally, the research also shows that reduction in loneliness and isolation is possible. And there are certain approaches that seem to work. Meaningful, active engagement, increasing one's lifestyle, both face-to-face and digital contact. Across the spectrum, again, it's the promotion of age-friendly environments is another area which research is showing, both in the United States and globally, can have a positive impact on loneliness and isolation for older adults.
Ellen, would you like to add anything?
I looked at this study that AARP did with Stanford University, and they were studying the link between social isolation and Medicare spending. And they found that there is an additional $6.7 billion in Medicare spending related to social isolation, And I think coming out of COVID, there's also an abundance of research that is coming out that significantly shows the impacts of social isolation on our health, in addition to everything that Beth talked about.
It just comes across as being so detrimental to an individual's health, physically, emotionally, mentally. And then to also hear about the financial strain on the healthcare system, it really shows the predominance of what an important issue this is to discuss. Ellen, let's stay with you for the next question. Can you talk about what are some risk factors for loneliness?
Sure. Well, there are many risk factors. And when talking about the risk factors, it's important to note that many of them are bidirectional and can influence each other, meaning having one or more of the risk factors can increase your risk for loneliness, and experiencing loneliness can vice versa increase the risk of developing or exacerbating a health condition. So when talking about the risk factors, I think it's safe to say that as we age, any physical, cognitive, or mental health condition that impacts our function, independence, or well-being can be considered a potential risk factor. Additionally, changes in our environment, our lifestyle, and social connections also increase the risk for loneliness. I'm going to go through some of the bigger risk factors. This isn't a comprehensive list, but I think they're some of the most common ones. And one of them being a change in social connections and or social isolation. So throughout life, there are varying factors and reasons as to why our social networks and connections change. We all experience this. Commonly, they're due to death of a loved one or even a pet. Change in relationship status. Again, this could be from a death or a possible divorce. Change in the quality of our relationships. So strained relationships or just feeling less connected to certain people in our lives that we may have been close with at some point. And this can also occur when individual or friends need to transition to a different living environment, such as assisted living or skilled nursing community, or perhaps moving to a different city to be near family. If you've lived in the same home or community for 40 or 50 years and then need to move to a new location, this can be very traumatic and feel really isolating, even if you are moving to a place where there are more people. And I talk to many of my members who say, you know, my friends are dying and or moving away to communities or to be closer to their families. So I think it's a very, very common risk factor. Retirement can also be can contribute to the change in loss of social connections and can lead to people feeling bored or lack of meaning in their life. And also, the change in our social networks can be due to a decline in health, not only for the individual, but for your friends and family. And that significantly can impact your social engagement and participation in social activities, which brings us to the next big risk factor, changes in health or functional status. And as we age, we begin to experience changes in our body systems due to disease or just wear and tear on our bodies over the years. And some of these more isolating changes can be due to hearing loss or loss of vision, or perhaps both, a decline in mobility and balance, pain, incontinence, fatigue, shortness of breath, and cognitive impairments that impact memory and function. And these can really all cause people to begin to restrict their activities, their ability to go out into the community and engage with others, and absolutely lead to isolation and loneliness. So, managing these physical and cognitive changes is extremely challenging and very emotional for both the individual and caretakers or family and people in their lives. And that can be very isolating in and of itself, and also contribute to emotional health stressors such as depression and anxiety. So I mentioned the emotional health impact, and the having a mental health diagnosis in and of itself can also be a risk factor. I think people who have a mental health diagnosis baseline, as you age and go through the life stressors and things that come up as you age, can exacerbate some of these conditions. For example, if you are experiencing a death or get a serious health diagnosis or a global pandemic, I think you can sort of see the bidirectional nature that I was talking about earlier, especially with this risk factor. So another one that I think is a pretty big one is being a caregiver. And as we care for people in our lives and maybe become the primary caretaker for a loved one, it 100% impacts the routine and habits of that caretaker, and socializing, engagement in activities, certainly self-care becomes secondary and sometimes non-existent for many caretakers. So this can be really stressful, lonely, and an isolating process to go through. And there's definitely a variety of studies that also show the negative health impacts that caregivers can experience due to caregiver burnout. Some of the other risk factors that might get overlooked, but I think are worth noting, lack of access to technology, financial stressors, lack of access to transportation, and being in an underserved or vulnerable population, such as our LGBTQ community, or maybe people that live in a high crime neighborhood that might be afraid to go out or be seen with a assistive device or impairment. So there are a lot of risk factors, but it's certainly not always just one. It can be a combination.
And what you're saying, the message that I'm hearing is just imagine if you have a few of those issues that you're dealing with. Imagine if you're going through hearing loss, you have a mobility impairment, and the area in which you live is not ADA friendly. So these multiple factors are absolutely going to be something that may be hard to overcome. And then if you don't have access to technology, how might you try to start addressing it from home? So it just hearing all of the different factors that go into it just is really, I'm processing everything you just said. Beth, is there anything that you'd like to add about the risk factors for loneliness?
I think that the underlying theme that Ellen points out is that all of these things have the risk of isolating anyone. So even somebody who's not lonely, even somebody who has an active network can be at risk, if they're experiencing any one of these situations. So it's just, and awareness is a key to prevention. So like everything else, being aware of our preventative health needs, our preventative mental health needs, I think as we grow older, being aware of the risk factors and approaching it in a preventative way is helpful for all of us.
So my next question goes with the risk factors for loneliness. I'd like to get into some of the contributing factors to loneliness. And I'm wondering, Beth, if you could provide an example or two of what that may look like and perhaps help individuals listening start to identify if they see themselves in these narratives or they see a friend or a loved one.
Sure. I think one great example is incontinence. It's an issue that almost everybody that I talk to in my work deals with to some degree, either personally or by way of a family member. It's a very common issue. It comes up to varying degrees, but it's also one of those issues that can be embarrassing to talk about. It can create a stigma, and it also can be addressed and can be manageable. But by not addressing it can put somebody at risk again for isolation and loneliness. And just to give sort of some examples, so, and urinary incontinence is probably reported more often than say fecal incontinence in my experience. And so to give an example, people will complain to me that it's, hard to get out for certain activities because they have to manage the incontinence in terms of timing. So they may be less willing to go on long drives or to go out for the whole day or to go to certain activities if they can't time getting to the bathroom in time. There's also, I think it also creates fear again of having a problem, having to manage the issue in a public space. And then that can create anxiety. Then that anxiety can lead to further sort of self-isolation. So then people tend to change their behaviors, change the way that they interact on a daily basis or in terms of family interactions, vacation patterns. And that has a direct impact on their social engagement. And then that can have an impact on their feelings of loneliness and isolation. And that's something, so for an example, that's one of the areas that we address when we go out to meet with members and we talk about these things and we ask how they're doing, because there are things that people can do to try to manage it. And one example with incontinence is we have a relationship with one of our providers, our resource directory, which is a durable medical equipment company, but they also have an incontinence management program where they provide clinical guidance for people who have questions about products and any issues they may be having. There's a range of products out there. Some are higher quality, and there are products that are better for mobility issues versus nighttime incontinence management. And these products, so this service can help people understand their issue better and maybe understand the products that are available to help manage the issue, and they can be delivered to one's door in a discreet and private manner. So that is just sort of one example of how it can impact one's life and also how it might be addressed. I think with other like mobility and driving status, those have similar impacts in that changes to mobility, changes to one's ability to drive, can result in self-limiting and self-isolating behaviors. If somebody can't drive and they don't have access to technology, then it makes them more reliant on another person to help manage the logistics of transportation. I think depending on where a person lives, we see a difference. There's a difference between more rural and more urban experiences in terms of transportation support. I think there's many more options now than there used to be. And so some of those air challenges are less of an issue for everyone in terms of opportunities like Lyft and Uber. And there's even opportunities to use third-party support programs like Go-Go Grandparents for individuals who can't drive and who can't rely themselves on technology to manage those transportation needs. And I think that's another area, another reason why when we do see members, we try to address all of these areas globally at each visit to try to identify areas where we can help members find resources.
So the one thing that came out loud and clear of what we can be looking for are changes in behavior, changes in patterns, just changes in an individual who we know tends to behave and go certain places at certain times. If we start to see changes, perhaps we could bring up a conversation about what might be going on with those individuals.
And you might see some other changes too. You might see a change. Somebody who may be experiencing loneliness may have an increased activity in terms of phone activity. They may reach out more often, although some individuals may become more avoidant and may be less responsive. So I think any kind of change in communication pattern may be one reason to reach out. Another example is an overuse of technology. Sometimes with older adults, if you see a really significant increase in the use of technology, reliance on social media, time spent on the computer, that can be another example of loneliness. Not a direct message, but an indirect message that somebody may be experiencing some feelings of loneliness or isolation.
Excellent points. Ellen, would you like to add any examples?
Well, I just want to comment on what the things Beth were saying and the risk factors that I went over, how hard it is to go through these life changes, and we're not prepared for them. And when you get there and you get to a certain point in your life and all these things and changes start happening, it can be really overwhelming to know what to do and to know where are my resources, how can I make changes, how can I still lead an engaged, happy life as all these things are happening. And I think Beth made a really good point of just, when we're going out as care coordinators or you're going to different healthcare appointments, just talking about it or talking about with friends and trying to identify different strategies, which we will get into later, but that you can put into place to overcome and keep doing the things that you might want to be able to do despite some of the physical and health changes.
Ellen, what stories from your experience in the field might you have about isolating patterns and how to break them?
Sure. When I'm thinking of these isolating patterns, I definitely want to keep in mind all of the risk factors and things Beth talked about as well, and all of the barriers and complexities and dynamics involved with them, and how each of us handle and manage some of these life changes certainly play a role in our overall happiness and our ability to overcome life obstacles and health changes. And I think there's definitely a psychological component to this. And when I think about isolating patterns, I think one of the big ones can just be feeling stuck or feeling like you're in a rut. And certainly when you're starting to experience changes that are limiting your mobility or ability to see or hear, I think this can start snowballing rather quickly, and you start to maybe withdraw or not getting out and participating in the activities that you used to be able to doing, and then you're sort of in this loneliness and isolated pattern. And when this happens, it definitely can start to make people feel depressed and hopeless, and sometimes these feelings can sort of go away on their own with some time, but other times they can linger and really start to cause significant stress. And when you have when you're in these ruts and feeling stuck, it does take some behavior change and intervention. And if you don't put forth an effort, sometimes you end up again in this very isolating pattern. And for certain people, I think this can be much more complicated than others, depending on what they might have going on in their lives, whether in terms of physical or mental health or other family dynamics. But let's say if you're really depressed, sometimes just getting up and getting out of bed can feel like a heck of a lot. And so the idea of maybe having to go talk to somebody or find a therapist or join a new social group can seem extremely daunting. And I think Beth made a point earlier, just that it's important to have an awareness and identify what's going on for you and why, and maybe what factors are contributing to your loneliness and isolation, and maybe what actions you can take to start working towards it. And if you don't know what those might be, the first step could be just talking to somebody about what's going on for you. And again, we will get into some more specific intervention ideas later, but I think there has to be an awareness and a level of effort or action put forth to reframe or change your attitude towards a particular situation. And another isolating pattern, I think, that sometimes comes up for my members is they feel like they're just going to doctor's appointments all the time, and all they're doing is just trying to put out the fires of their medical issues, and they don't really feel like they have much of a life outside of that. And again, that could be really overwhelming. And yes, you're seeing healthcare people and you're seeing people, but it's not the type of connections you necessarily want. And I also see people who get stuck in unhealthy relationships or unsatisfying relationships as you get older. This obviously could be with a couple, or it could be with your children or family members or friends. And this can make people feel really trapped and stuck. And again, I think it's just recognizing and being aware of what's going on, how it's impacting you. How much is it stressing you out, and trying to figure out how you can make some action and what you can do about it and who you can talk to. When I also think about this isolating patterns, I think some of the factors that can contribute to that and are worth noting are sometimes people feel shame and embarrassment about being lonely, and they don't want to talk about it, or they try and hide it. Sometimes people might have a sense of fear of they don't want to try something new. Maybe they feel like they won't be accepted, or they might fail. they might feel pessimistic and feel like, well, I've tried this, I've tried that, nothing seems to work. I still feel lonely, even though I've tried everything. And also for people who might just be a little bit more anxious or shy, again, trying something new or going out and starting being in a social setting might be really intimidating. And I think all these things can contribute to people, again, feeling stuck or just not being able to break out of an isolating pattern. But I think it does take an attitude shift. And interestingly, when I talk to members that are in their 90s, mid to late 90s, and they're still independent and doing all the things they like to do. And I kind of think like, well, what's your secret sauce here? And I honestly think when I ask them about loneliness and kind of going through all the things they need to go through in life with health changes, they're have a resiliency and ability to just sort of recognize, okay, this is happening, and move on and not perseverate too much or dwell on it to the point that it starts stressing them out. And for certain people, it's much easier than others. So I think this is a very complicated, and there's a lot of dynamics at play as to why people get stuck in these isolating patterns.
We have a podcast episode about resilience, and everything that you're talking about right now about feeling stuck, getting in a rut, feeling overwhelmed, struggling with change, especially change that you have no control over. So I'm remembering some of those tips from the resilience professional I spoke with. So I just want to let our listeners know there is an episode out there that may be worth a listen if that's something that you're interested in exploring further. Also, I have a 96-year-old grandmother who I adore, and I often think she is the most resilient person I know in my entire life. And I've had a conversation with her about it before, about when she's gone through loss or tough times in her life. And her advice to me, she's like, well, Cher, I just talk to myself. And I just know I've done it before. I can do it again. And I just talk to myself and I coach myself through it. And I'm like, what sage advice. And I love that if you've done it once, you could do it again. So if you've been through something tough and you're going through something tough now, you have the ability to get through it. And please reach out to someone who you think you can trust, who'd be able to help you, including your wellness and care coordinator, if you are a Friends Life Care member. Would you prefer to age independently in your own home or live in a nursing facility? I know what I'd rather do. Friends Life Care membership offers just that. Plan today for a future lived at home with vitality, independence, growth, and resilience while protecting your savings. Learn about your options at a free seminar or webinar. Register at friendslifecare.org/register or call 215-628-8964. Beth, is there anything that you would like to add on the isolating patterns topic?
I would just add, in response to both your comments, really that to approach this to some degree incrementally, like readiness and change happen incrementally. And you brought up a great word, which is coaching. And part of what we do as care coordinators, every time we meet with members, is to try to address where they are, what their goals are, if there's any impediments to those goals. And we try to help coach them in their efforts toward meeting their goals. And that is not a one-time activity. And it's, you can't approach anything as, I'm going to turn around my heart disease. I'm going to turn around my high blood pressure. It has to be incremental. It has to be consistent. And that's okay. And that's the most manageable way to make change. And it's our approach in our relationship with our members. And I would just, sometimes things just seem daunting because we make them bigger than they need to be. And that would be my response.
Beth, I've been a part of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Task Force's special projects. Can you talk about these initiatives?
Sure. So as part of our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Task Force, in the winter of 2022, we first embarked on a project to reach out to our members who were at particular risk of loneliness because of extreme isolation. These were members who were in facilities, who lived alone, who had been alone for large portions of COVID. And so we participated with an organization called Brighten a Day, where we participated in sending out cards to all of these isolated members. And we participated in this on an organization-wide basis. It had a very positive response. Then we were lucky enough to get a grant conjunction with Friends Foundation for the Aging to serve our isolated and members at risk of loneliness with a project which we named Random Acts of Kindness. And what we did with this grant money was we used the grant money to try to alleviate loneliness and isolation by matching members, the Random Acts of Kindness with members' particular needs, recreational interests. We targeted members who were not only at risk of loneliness due to isolation, but who had also been through recent changes due to a loss of a loved one or a move or a particular life transition. We were able to reach 27 members. We provided a range of very creative random acts of kindness. Again, it was very well received. And as a result, the organization has decided to move forward permanently with an ongoing effort to continue with this project. And so it's in its infancy, but what we are hoping to do in the is to reach more members who are, again, at risk of isolation and loneliness for various reasons. And our first anticipated project is going to be a pen pal project with a local element of Quaker elementary school in the Philadelphia area. So we're still in the early stages of developing the logistics for this particular project, but we're hoping just to continue with the overall endeavor.
Anything to add, Ellen?
Just maybe a personal story from participating in the project. I identified a member who has Alzheimer's and transitioned from her home to a memory care unit. And there was a cat, there was a real cat on the memory care unit, and it passed away. And my member's husband told me this story, and I instantly thought about the cats that they're sort of robotic cats that simulate almost a real kitty. They purr and they wag their little tails. And I got one of my members this cat, and I went over, delivered it, and my member really liked the cat a lot, and it was a success in that realm. It really made the day of my member, the husband, myself. But what also happened was that the memory care unit decided to purchase an additional robotic cat for the other residents. And so this was certainly, one random act of kindness sort of turned into another one. And it's just a really great project, and really it does make a difference.
I love the Random Acts of Kindness initiative that we're doing. And that story is so heartwarming. And it does exactly what a random act of kindness should do. It makes everyone's day who's involved. And then it also catches on so that other people are motivated by random acts of kindness. Beth, what is the difference between loneliness compared to isolation?
And Ellen has alluded to this to some degree, but loneliness is a subjective feeling. It is the feeling of being alone, of feeling separated, not feeling connected to others. Isolation is an objective, measurable lack of social network, lack of context, having few people with whom to interact regularly. It speaks to both the existence as well as the structure of one's relationships. So it is, you can live alone and not feel lonely or isolated. At the same time, you can live surrounded by other people and still have feelings of loneliness. They can occur independently of one another. I think the most important thing to understand is the occurrence of either raises these risk factors for negative physical and psychological impact and have negative impact on our functioning and overall well-being. When we talk about the two together, social isolation and loneliness, they fall under the umbrella of what we call social connectedness. And as you alluded to before, lack of social connectedness has a huge impact on our health, and it is a major predictor of early death. It is equivalent, it raises the same risk of early death as it does smoking 15 cigarettes a day, as being obese, as having alcohol dependence. So it's a huge risk factor for well-being. And that's really the difference. And as Ellen noted, when a person is isolated, it raises the risk of more loneliness because there's the lack of connections, lack of ability to get out, there's lack of support, sometimes lack of resources. So all of that can exacerbate some of the underlying challenges. And again, people who are lonely may be coming at it from a negative deficit in terms of being able to then address the lack of isolation and the loneliness, and to try to come up with a proactive plan to address things.
Ellen, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so I think there's the idea of having some personal choice over being isolated or being alone is good to understand. And being alone is not, it can be a risk factor, but that doesn't mean you're lonely. And so there's really no understanding the stereotypes around what we might think of a lonely person or an isolated person sometimes is not always the case. And I think it's as Beth said, and we're saying it's such an individual experience, and understanding what it means to each person, and what if they're not really experiencing distress and you're alone, it just knowing what is going to really cause somebody to have the loneliness to a level where it's starting to become a problem.
I feel it may go back to that personality conversation that we were just having, where some people may enjoy solitude. And from an outside perspective, that may appear as loneliness or isolation. But for that individual person and their personality, they may really like solitude, and having a few social connections here and there may fill their cup. So I appreciate what we really do need to look at the individual. Yes, it is a global problem. However, some individuals may perfectly like their solitude, and that's okay too, as long as they're not experiencing and creeping into all the negative impacts that we talk about, if it gets to a point where it does start turning to loneliness and isolation.
Yeah, I actually, picking up off that, I think, and I'll get into this a little bit later, just with some of my members' experiences, but since we're on the topic, just there's been a handful of people that I've talked to, and just not just members, but friends and family, where it's okay, you identify that you have feelings of loneliness, but you're sort of able to put it in a box, recognize it for what it is, and as you were saying, Cheryl, not let it start feeding into other areas where it becomes more problematic.
And I would also argue, as coming as an introvert who likes to be alone, that there are benefits to time alone, and I, as somebody who benefits from that regularly, again, it's subjective. It's about where the person is in the moment. It can be situational and can be could be a chronic issue, but it's a self-reflection.
Ellen, we're ready for the strategies to work through loneliness.
So the key here is really understanding the individual and taking a bit of a comprehensive approach, because this is, again, what we're saying, this is going to be different for everybody. You need to understand what are your individual contributors to loneliness and isolation. And then also recognizing, do I want help, or does my loved one want help? And then focusing on how can we help that person, or how can I help myself? And I think we can really we all can play a role here in awareness for ourselves, but the people around us, and identifying people that might be more at risk, and maybe offering a space to talk or inviting conversations to start addressing some of this, because is not something that I think people understand loneliness for what it means to them, but on the global health scale, the bigger impact that it, and I think that it's starting to become, again, with COVID, that sort of highlighted a little bit more of the importance of what this does to us. So how social connections, how important they are. So talking to your healthcare provider, for many people, they might only have the only person they might be talking to is their healthcare provider. So I think we healthcare professionals, including care coordinators, Friends Life Care, play a role in helping people strategize and develop interventions for addressing. So your primary care physician, you can talk to a geriatrician, psychologist, psychiatrist, social workers, occupational therapists, physical therapist, recreational therapist. One of the things I think that comes up is sometimes in our healthcare system, there isn't that much time necessarily. So even if people are going to see their healthcare providers, this doesn't always come up due to lack of time. There might be so many other things on the list that they're not having the conversations. So if it's something you are aware of, bringing it up yourself, but I think there also needs to be an awareness from healthcare providers as well. So we sort of talked about the therapy, but I think Beth had mentioned that, I know from talking to some of my members, when I bring up talking to a therapist, sometimes it's met with some resistance, and I've tried that, or I've tried a therapist, and they haven't been able to do anything to help me. But I sometimes think therapists get a bad rap, and I think that there is a true benefit in it. It's just finding the right therapist for you. Support groups, whether it's sort of a community-based and on a local level, so a church, library, townships, park and recs. I think there's a lot of resources out there that people, if you're looking for them, or again, as healthcare providers, to be aware of. And even within healthcare networks, bereavement groups, support groups, but it's identifying what's going to be the right fit for you. So if you just lost your husband, you might not want to go to a social group where there's going to be a lot of couples. For some people, that might not be a problem. For other people, it could be very triggering. So just making sure you're finding the right group that fits, that's what's going to help and support you. Some of the larger organizations, AARP, your area for aging, there's a site called Elder Care Locator, where you can type in your zip code and it'll bring up resources within your community or city. The National Council on Aging, National Institute on Aging, these are all places where people can go to get resources that they might not know about otherwise. Excuse me. Locally, there's actually through the Penn Memory Center, they offer in-home companion services for both individuals and also caregivers. I think it's $10 an hour, but they will match a college student to go and spend time with somebody, or offer a caregiver some respite care so that caregiver can then get a break. And then that same organization, Penn Memory Center, also has it's called a weekly smile, where they pair college students to write a letter or make a phone call. And there's other organizations out there that do this as well. So I think there's resources and things for people to access, but part of the problem is when you're in that, when you're feeling isolated, when you're feeling lonely, sometimes it's hard to identify and kind of get away from that inward. Being able to take a step outside, and how can I put the effort in? Because sometimes when you're really lonely and feeling super sad, you don't really feel like putting the effort in. So I think it's just helpful for, again, healthcare providers, all of us sort of understanding what might be out there and how to help people.
And perhaps a place for people who are experiencing loneliness and isolation to start can be to identify someone who you feel is a safe person to talk to, whether it's a family member, a friend, a neighbor, a healthcare provider, and perhaps prepare yourself to have a conversation with this other person about how you're feeling. Jot down some notes so you remember what you want to talk about, and even start the conversation by saying, it's very hard for me to talk about this, and I chose you because I feel safe with you. I want to talk about some negative ways I've been feeling lately. Can you have this conversation with me? And I would hope that people on the receiving end of that can step up and step in and help support that person. I'm sure it would be very scary to make that call, but I think it might be a place to start.
I had a conversation with Dr. Jamie Swanson, who is the medical director for Friends Life Care. And so she really suggested giving yourself or somebody else, if you're making recommendations, 2 to 3 recommendations. Don't overwhelm. Try and identify 2 to 3 that are very specific and individualized. And then if you're being met with resistance, maybe trying to understand where that might be coming from. And oftentimes it is a psychological reason. And that could be needing to get maybe some further psych interventions. And so I think it's important to note that, and to not overwhelm people, but start small and try and make some mini goals and achieve some smaller goals that can then build on itself.
Beth, do you have anything to add before we move into some ways to increase your social network and support system?
I would just add, as far as interventions, and this is part of increasing the support system. But one of my favorite ways to, or recommendations for people, is senior centers. You know, the senior centers were started in this country to be the community-based center at the point of connection for older adults for information and services and connection. And they are literally there to help people, older adults, build connections, make new friendships. They have a variety of services that range from lunch programs to health and wellness programs to educational, recreational activities. So they're a very welcoming and open environment for people who are either coming into a new environment. I had a great aunt who moved to the area after many years away, and she was very lonely. She moved, she was, I think, about 87 when she moved, and she didn't know anybody anymore in this area. And so she went to a senior center, and it changed everything. She started off just going to the lunch program, but she made a friend at the lunch program, and that friend invited her to the card games. And then that became part of her weekly activity. That became part of her informal support network. And it became a very positive and important outlet for her. And during COVID, senior centers really expanded to provide remote programming for people who are isolated. Some are continuing to do that. And some of the senior centers in our area are quite dynamic and have quite a range of programming for everything from games and sports to, again, high-level education programming, cultural events, things like that.
And I think this really highlights the need too for funding for these, for resources, and making sure that money is being put aside to help people have access and have programs they can participate in.
And regarding the senior centers, my perspective would be that, like, walking into a senior center, you know that there are other people going there to make connections, to have some socialization, to be around other people, or to partake in a hobby that they enjoy. So you're of course you're right, but that you're setting yourself up for success going to a place like this where other people are congregating in community. They will be people in your age group and people who are looking to make connections. So that seems like a fairly safe place to start if people are looking as a place to start when they're ready to go to that level.
And you can try things out. You could try one, you could go for one day. You can try one activity. It can be a passive activity, which does, it's open to a large level of comfort levels and interest levels. So I highly recommend them.
Would either of you like to add anything else to the ways to increase your social network and support system?
The research, really, there's not a lot of research out there in terms of the efficacy of interventions in terms of loneliness, but the one of the main themes is that a mindful approach to trying to combat the issue, starting with, first of all, self-care, like making sure, as Ellen said, first of all, checking in with one's doctor, trying to maintain even like a healthy daily lifestyle and structure to the day. And then looking at mindful group research shows that group interventions with meaningful activities have had some positive impact. And again, through senior centers, volunteer groups, faith-based groups, public libraries, and finding an activity that's either a new activity to learn or relearning an old hobby, taking a class. All of those activities contribute positively to reducing loneliness. Another recommendation is again to be sort of mindful in trying to actively commit to maintaining the current level of communication within one's own structure. So within one's own informal support system, making an attempt to stay in touch with people, whether it's by phone or email, FaceTime, video chat, using using technology to assist with that, again, with video chat or with companion robots. Being mindful in our approach has a measurable impact in whichever way we choose to tackle it. And for everybody, again, it may be individual, and it may be, it may not be in a large group interaction. It may be in a much, in a smaller setting.
Yeah, with that, following up, that same study with it talked about just developing an orientation of acceptance towards the present moment experiences as critical for mitigating some of the social risk factors. And I think there's this acceptance piece with having to, if you have some of these risk factors or going through certain life experiences, having to accept that. And for certain people, that's easier than others. And I think that the mindfulness approach can be very helpful for many people. And again, looking at it from a multifaceted for when we're looking at some strategies, it might take a few different angles. So, you might have to take sort of maybe the mindfulness in combination with going to a senior center, in combination with maybe one other thing. And for some people, it might take a few different aspects versus just one thing that will cure your loneliness.
I think sometimes I've had feedback from members when they've put themselves out there into different situations, they weren't expecting to get maybe as much of a positive response back. I've had several members, for example, who worship in one form of a faith-based community, but for one reason or another, we're not part of that community, but explored social or worship opportunities at another faith-based community, were then surprised to find that they found new opportunities or new friendships. And it wasn't necessarily that they were, again, like moving from one community to the other, but for reasons of geographic proximity. And in one person's case, they had a friend who was attending a program at a faith-based community. So they attended the program and then found that they enjoyed it and the program itself, and it opened them up to new friendships. So I think some element of sometimes you can find things in areas where we weren't necessarily looking.
Over the past few months, you've both been connecting with our members about their experiences with loneliness. I know you're both going to want to speak about this question. We'll start with Ellen. Let us know what insight you may have gleaned.
So I really was surprised by how different it is for everybody. And I wasn't really having as many of these conversations prior. And I sort of found myself things that I thought certain would be maybe triggers for certain members were not. And they may have felt some loneliness from a completely different variable. And so I just, again, just understanding how all the variables in one's life can impact social connections, and also the resilience of what people go through and how they handle life experiences, and that impact on how they perceive themselves and experience changes with their social units. And I thought that was, it just, I can't say, I was hoping I would find trends, and there are. I mean, I'm sure if I was able to talk to every Friends Life Care member, I would probably be able to find some more trends, but I was surprised that I didn't find as many trends as I thought I would.
I would add, though, however, I think one trend we're continuing to see is that this issue has been exacerbated by COVID, and it continues to be an issue for everybody to some degree. For some people to a much larger degree. And that is a theme that I'm still continuing to hear from people. I tend to work with a larger population in care. And I think some of the themes that I see there are especially isolation for the caregivers, isolation for those who have recently lost, especially a close loved one, ongoing need for one-on-one and group support for, especially for particular individuals, or for the caregivers, especially caregivers of individuals with dementia, and for those suffering with chronic illnesses, for whom many of the community-based resources still aren't completely back in place for them. I think there's still some of that fallout, which creates, that exacerbates the loneliness and isolation that can come with those situations.
Another thing that I found interesting was for many of my widowed female members, a lot of them I just identified wanting just a companion, a male companion, not a boyfriend, just somebody to do activities with. And I said, if you could wave your magic wand, I know we can't bring your husband back, but if there was something that we could do to help you, what would it be? And that was a common answer. And I think having these conversations and asking people is something that more healthcare professionals need to do, but just, again, something we all can do.
Beth, might you share how Friends Life Care is dealing with loneliness?
Sure. So as many know, at Friends Life Care, we have Vigor program, and through Vigor was started, as an attempt to improve our members' the trajectory of their health by improving their health and wellness, in both physical and psychological. But a part of that is also to improve social connectedness among members. And so through Vigor, we have a range of programs, which include fitness programs. For example, they just finished a Tai Chi program. They are starting a mindfulness meditation program this week. We've done a range of functional fitness programs. They offer educational programming. They've done a number of support groups in the past. They recently did one on anxiety, and they're working on putting together a support group for grief, as well as a men's support group. So through Vigor, there are a number of opportunities to engage, to learn, to meet other members, to meet Friends Life Care staff. We are continually trying to address the issue through the different range of programming that we offer. But additionally, through the care coordination team, as individuals, as Ellen said, this is something we try to address one-on-one with our members when we see them, whether it's at the annual visit or we're seeing members in care regularly. We try to have discussions and help them find resources. We have a resource directory where we have access to over 400 health and wellness resources, which are, a range of information, again, for individual resources and group activities. So this is a topic that we are continually trying to approach and share information and resources with our members.
Ellen, would you like to add anything?
I agree with what Beth said.
So before we close out this episode, I'd like to give you both the opportunity to give any final thoughts that you might have on loneliness and isolation. Ellen, can we start with you?
Sure. I think we all need to have some self-compassion, and this is something that we all go through at some point in our lives, and it can be really challenging and really stressful and difficult. And there are resources out there it does take a level of effort sometimes to get going, but I think that if we have an awareness and we sort of work together collectively as humans, we can try and do a bit better in addressing and working to improve the social connections for everybody.
I would agree. I would say, I think the challenge of loneliness is it's something that every single one of us has and will feel at some point in time. And so to be aware of that personally, I try, as I learn more and more of the subject, I try to look at it and approach it as the same way I approach my physical health, which is try to be sort of mindfully on a daily basis, approach it as healthfully and mindfully as I can as a daily practice. I think also we're beginning to recognize that this is an issue for us as a community, as a country, and globally. And we're finally seeing that the conversation is happening on the local and the national and the global level, that there are things that we can do as individuals, there are things that we can do as communities to review the way we structure ourselves and the way we approach the issue and the way we strive to make people feel more included and less lonely. And I have hope that we're moving in the right direction.
Ellen and Beth, thank you for this thorough discussion about the causes, effects, and ways to combat loneliness. I appreciate all the thought, research, and preparation that I know you put into this conversation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ellen Houle and Beth Morley for joining us today. You can learn more about Beth on LinkedIn and Ellen and Beth by visiting our website, friendslifecare.org. If you like our show, please rate, review, subscribe, and join us next time. To learn more about aging with vitality, independence, growth, and resilience, subscribe to our blog at friendslifecare.org/blog.